Similar to increasing wealth gap, are we experiencing an increasing educational gap? Are well-educated getting more educated and undereducated staying undereducated? Edit. Thanks everyone for many different perspectives and interesting arguments. One statistic brought up was global educational attainment rising overall, which is a quite well-known development, and I'm glad it is taking place. Another point brought up was education and degrees. In this question, I don't necessarily equal attained education with received degrees but rather with actual acquired knowledge, including knowledge gained through non-institutional education. I realize we need quantifiable ways to measure educational attainment, and awarded degrees is one of them. Though imperfect, it is better than non-existent. One just has to be careful about interpreting what exactly that number tells us. It also begs the question, what is the best way to measure acquired knowledge? An educational gap has existed in some form since the dawn of formal education. However, in case there is a trend of a growing educational gap, what concerns me is the possible emergence of an educational divide. Depending on the definition of educational divide and high-quality data available, such divide might potentially be underway. TLDR. Yes and no. There is no direct connection between having an education and then getting more education as a result. However, education leads to more money, and more money leads to more opportunities for education and more success in obtaining education, both for an individual and for that individual's children. It would be perfectly correct to say that the wealth gap has created an education gap because the American education system is so dependent upon local economies. Sociology professor here. It can be stated as a scientific fact that wealth inequality exists in America. It can also be stated as a scientific fact that wealthy individuals are more likely to graduate high school, graduate college, and obtain advanced degrees. Therefore, the wider the inequality in wealth, the wider the inequality in education. However, there is a worse problem that's hidden in that statement. Education attainment is not a perfect indicator of how educated a person is. That's sort of counterintuitive, so here is an example. Group A poor section of town has low property values, which means less taxes that fund schools. This then means that the school cannot hire the best teachers because it cannot pay very well. This means that the education being received by students is delivered by average or below average teachers, that textbooks and campus facilities are more likely to be outdated, and that after-school activities and extracurriculars are more likely to utilize subpar equipment. Group B. A wealthy neighborhood has high property values, which means plenty of funding for schools. They can afford high salaries, so many teachers apply to work here, meaning the school can select the best of the best. They also have money to keep their facilities and extracurricular activities up to date. Now, if both Group A and Group B have a perfect 100% graduation rate, can we say that the students that graduate have the same education? Yes and no. They passed 12th grade, but in one situation the academics were more rigorous and the education included more than just the bare minimum. So on one hand we can point to statistics that say America's graduation rates are increasing, so we must be smarter. On the other hand, our schools are getting less funding, and in some neighborhoods the curriculum are more lax. Therefore the graduation rates increasing may be showing that our schools are getting easier to pass. Some studies have shown that private schools emphasize critical thought and leadership, while public schools are more likely to emphasize discipline, cooperation, and obedience. Is this a disparity? In a way. Leadership and critical thought are skills needed in management and entrepreneurial jobs, while cooperation and obedience are more useful in menial labor. This isn't specifically tied to school funding, but it is worth noting that education quality will affect job prospects and success. Lawmakers and policymakers are well aware of these trends. To correct for this, America has the No Child Left Behind law, which forces all public schools to meet at least a minimum standard of education. The problem is that some schools barely meet it, while other, well-funded, schools exceed it by leaps and bounds. Some states also have a Robin Hood law, which takes excess money from wealthy neighborhoods and redistributes it to poor neighborhoods to keep schools from becoming too polarized. These are effective, but not perfect, and I'm not an expert on this area, so I'll leave it at that. However, all of this just says that the wealth gap creates an education gap. So the next question is, does higher education create more education? For an individual, no. Most people seek a particular degree, and then stop seeking education. If education snowballed like the op implies that then we'd have individuals who obtain dozens of Ph.D.s, and that's pretty rare. It is common, though, that educated parents are more likely to raise educated children. Paywall. There's a lot of different factors here, mostly having to do with parents' higher education meaning more income and more free time. At the same time, this social fact is why colleges have programs set aside to specifically help first-generation college students. People who go to college when their parents hadn't gone to college are half as likely to graduate as students whose parents do have a degree. In summary, the answer is a soft yes. There is an education gap in America and it is growing, but it has more to do with the wealth gap and school funding than with education specifically. I think you need to define we. This would be very different for each country's laws. Things like access to education, ability to use that education to actually benefit lifestyle, etc., will dictate the answer to this question. Good point. Let's have, if we can ideally, 5 times we. Is there a trend of an increasing educational gap, globally? In developed countries overall? In developing countries overall? In Europe, EU? Depending on what data can be found, in the US. Any of the 5 would be great.